if you want to save any species on Earth, there's really only one species you have to fully understand, and that's Homo sapiens, because we are the cause, and therefore we are the solution to just about every rewilding or biodiversity or climate concern.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World with me, Ben Golsmith. And I'm very excited to be sitting here with my friend Brett Jenks, who is the founder and chief executive of a really groundbreaking, interesting, impactful conservation organization named rare.org. And what Rare specializes in doing is harnessing the pride, the innate pride and love that communities have for the nature around them in order to deliver conservation outcomes. Brett, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thanks for having me.
Brett, could we possibly begin with the origins of Rare? I mean, it's such a good story. I'd love to hear it again.
The organization started in 1973. There was a pilot, a couple of bird watchers, a lawyer. They were traveling, spending a lot of time in the global south, and they realized that there was not a lot of environmental education going on and that they should perhaps do something about it. So Rare started off launching mini campaigns with posters and billboards focused on things like the snow leopard. Rare literally financed itself, according to the lore, in the early 70s by selling Save the Whales bumper stickers. That's how early they were in the movement. I joined probably around 1993, 94, when Rare was essentially focused on pride as a campaign. Paul Butler had led the program for several years in St. Lucia. And I would say sort of the origin story of Rare could easily begin with Paul Butler. He was a fellow Brit. He went to London Polytechnic as a senior, wrote a paper about the plight of the endangered St. Lucian parrot. And unbeknownst to him, his professor took his paper, which outlined 3 ways that St. Lucia could save the St. Lucian parrot. He sent it to the head of forestry of St. Lucia, who read the paper and surprisingly said, "Okay, smart guy, come on down." And I think he paid Paul $200 a month and gave him a little shack with no running water out in the bush in St. Lucia, and said, "Come on down. This will be your first job out of college, and implement your plan. You can save the St. Lucian parrot." Well, as soon as Paul arrived in St. Lucia, he realized there had been almost no environmental education. No one had ever heard of this bird. You know, an ornithologist from Great Britain would have heard of the St. Lucian parrot, but most people in St. Lucia didn't know much about it. And if they did, they would capture it and put it in a cage or sell it to a hotel who would put it in the lobby of a hotel in the cage. So it got to a point where there were probably 100 individuals left in the wild. And because no one had heard of it, Paul scratched his head and said, "My God, this is way harder than writing a paper. We have to change the mentality of the citizenry of St. Lucia. We're going to have to run a campaign, educate everybody, make this a cause for concern for the whole country." There were 160,000 people. I think at the time they had one traffic light, as he describes it. And so he set out to create one of the first national level campaigns to save an endangered species. And what it looked like was there was a mascot of the parrot, really homespun, really kitschy, very cheap mascot. They visited every school, and they would sort of reveal the mascot after a little puppet show, a little music, a little singing. They created a national anthem, essentially, for nature. Amazona versicolor, the national bird of St. Lucia. And literally today, if you fly into St. Lucia and you find someone over 50 and ask a customs officer to hum a few lines to that song, they still know it a generation later because they learned it as school kids and it was a really catchy, popular song. So just by using some really homespun sort of guerrilla marketing tactics, he changed the country. And from people knowing nothing about the St. Lucian parrot, it became eventually the national symbol of the newly independent St. Lucia. It's on the passport. Eventually, they created a national park, launched a couple of ecotourism businesses to take people out to visit. That national park ended up protecting the watershed, the central watershed of St. Lucia. So they got three or four big wins while saving a species. We did a census probably 15 years ago, and it had gone from 100 in the wild to more than 1,500. And farmers were now asking for permits to shoot them as pests on their farm. So it's really quite a remarkable story of recovery, of what you would call rewilding. And I would say that is that's now in the rare lore. That's been a generation ago, but that sort of approach is still infused inside almost everything we do today. And we have taken that kind of work and brought it to 60 countries in the global south. And now we've even brought it to Hollywood, which we can talk about later.
What's so fascinating is that when we think about environmental restoration, we think about government policy change. We think about shifting incentives. We think about stuff that tends to happen top down. What we don't think so often about is the public mood, attitudes of ordinary people towards a particular species or a particular landscape, which of course is the catalyst for getting those top-down measures to be put in place. How did that actually work in St. Lucia? This brilliant guy, arriving in St. Lucia and whipping up a frenzy of pride and interest and love for this parrot among the people of St. Lucia. How did that translate into policy actions that actually saved the parrot?
It's a great question. And I think you bring up one of the most important points, and frankly, one of the obstacles that we deal with day in and day out with the organization. We have a board member named Elke Weber, who runs her own lab at Princeton. She's a behavioral economist. And someday she may win a Nobel Prize for inventing this concept of the single action bias. And it's a really simple idea that we as humans, in order to get through our daily lives, we can be easily distracted. We need to simplify, just and routinize, our daily lives. So it's very easy for us, and it's very attractive to us to believe that there's a single action that is going to solve the problem. I lived in Washington, D.C. for 23 years. And the people in Washington, D.C. always believe that the only thing that matters is getting the policy passed. And they feel like it's almost a miracle when all of a sudden some rugged individual works really hard and convinces a cabinet member or minister, or then eventually the Congress. In your case, it would be in the parliament. And all of a sudden you have this celebration and raising of glasses. And the problem is solved because a policy has been enacted. That single action bias belies, is to your point, the social norms, the social acceptability, the opening up and aligning of what some call the Overton window that makes possible that legislation. Politicians tend not to lead as much as they scurry ahead of the pack, making sure they're leading the pack, but we all know that the pack in the end decides. And so if you're a skilled politician, you can be just one step ahead of where social norms are going. If you're an activist, one of the most effective things you can do is to create the norms, to create the signs that the pack is carrying, so that you're establishing the narrative that a politician is eventually going to take hold of and enable legislation with. And so we talk a lot about the enacting of policy being more like the halftime celebration. In the first half, you're building a movement, you're shifting social norms, you're making something new acceptable to society. And then you get legislation if you're very lucky and very crafty. But what happens in the second half? You don't win the game until the game is over. The second half is execution and implementation. And you still need marketing and a narrative. You need social proof and you need social pressure. And you need people to recognize, even when there aren't financial incentives for electric vehicles or heat pumps or solar panels or rewilding your farm, you still need to look around and see that other people are driving EVs, that other farmers are rewilding. We are innately social. We are primates. And so the thing that I like to repeat, and this is sort of new within our lexicon at Rare, is if you want to save any species on Earth, there's really only one species you have to fully understand, and that's Homo sapiens, because we are the cause, and therefore we are the solution to just about every rewilding or biodiversity or climate concern. And so, long-winded answer to your question, Ben, the bottom line is in St. Lucia, Paul was able to mobilize a community to create and spawn a recognition of and love for a particular species. And very craftily, that species was positioned as a symbol of pride in a newly independent nation. So over hell or high water, the people of St. Lucia were going to conserve this new symbol of their own newly found independence. And so that's how it got started.
So before we move on from St. Lucia and this conversation, what's the state of nature in St. Lucia today? And have those attitudes towards nature persisted since that brilliant campaign of Paul's centered around the St. Lucia parrot? I recently interviewed Jenny Daltrey from Rewild.org, who was sitting in Antigua at the time of our conversation. And she talked of the Caribbean being one of the most nature-depleted regions on Earth, but with tremendous efforts now taking place to restore species and landscapes and marine protected areas and invasive species removal from islands and all kinds of things happening. And I didn't talk with Jenny about Rare's work in St. Lucia. I wish I had. What's the situation in St. Lucia now, all these years later?
Well, like any nation, it struggles with both a growing history and record of meaningful conservation success while continuing to address new threats. I would say coastal development throughout the Caribbean has wiped out lots of mangroves, lots of habitat. There was an earlier generation before people began to focus on marine conservation. You know, most conservation started with forests, you know, with the vistas, with the landscapes. And so in St. Lucia, you have a host of protected areas that have done quite well. You can still, you know, we were very gratified to take our board of directors and visit, you know, a handful of years ago, and we saw St. Lucian parrots everywhere we visited the forest. And there was a time when you literally couldn't see them. So, but, you know, one species recovery is not it is an indication of conservation success, but it's not the whole enchilada. And of course, St. Lucia continues to push forward with conservation of forests, with protection of critically endangered ecosystems, and with marine protection, which now the Caribbean has started to turn its attention to in some really important ways. But I would say, if you go back 25 years and you look at the work of Paul Butler, what he did in St. Lucia, he then took to St. Vincent, and he repeated the process. He hired a local a guy from St. Vincent. He wrote a little cookbook that described every step that he took in St. Lucia, and that same process with an endemic endangered St. Vincent parrot was repeated. It too became a symbol of pride. It led to protection. Then he went to Montserrat and worked with the oriole. Then he went to Grenada. Then he went, you know, so on and so forth. Finally, running out of islands in the Caribbean, he went to the Indo-Pacific and started working in Kosrae and Yap and Rota, and saving and creating protected areas by instilling pride for endemic endangered birds. So it was about one species, but it ended up protecting the critical habitat that species relies on. So I would say the Caribbean has a great record of forestry conservation. I think where there's a lot of catch up needed right now would be on the marine protection side.
So what happened next for Rare? This is kind of an amazing discovery that Paul and the team made 25 years ago. You know, that if you can harness local pride around a particular species, you can galvanize a whole community to demand action of its leaders. You know, so this is kind of in a nutshell what Rare is about. And it's pretty unique in the environmental movement as far as I can make out. You know, so how is Rare using this insight in other parts of the world?
We immediately set out to clone Paul. We said, look, this guy's done an amazing thing. He's a youngster, recent college graduate, and spent the first 10 years after college, from age probably 22 to 32, figuring out how to make this work in St. Lucia. So step one was, how do we make this a repeatable and replicable success? And so, as I mentioned, we helped Paul with a small budget begin the process of identifying local leaders and training them, supporting them while they carried out a pride campaign in many other countries. That was a pretty successful endeavor. It wasn't easy to do. We tried a variety of ways, cookbooks, manuals. There's a 300-page how-to step-by-step manual with pre-written letters to the head of forestry, pre-written letters to the prime minister, pre-written letters to radio DJs, musicians, so that you can very quickly and effectively engage all of the cultural and political and religious leaders in a small country to join the cause. That was quite effective. And that was a way of templatizing and repeating success. But of course, over the last 25 years, things have become, population has grown, technology has been developed. These countries in the global south now have many more threats to nature. And so rare has had to become a little more sophisticated over time. There have been more than 500 St. Lucia type campaigns in more than 60 countries throughout the global south. So the first step, Ben, was replication. The second step was innovation. And it was, what is it going to take for us to begin to solve not just a localized problem, but global problems that are disproportionately impacted by local situations, local contexts. So what we decided to do then was to ask ourselves, so what are the globally significant challenges that can be addressed only at the local level? And so you begin to get into what are today some of the most challenging conservation problems we have on Earth. One of them that we prioritized about 12 years ago was coastal habitat conservation. So in the coastal waters around the developing world, you have a tragedy of the commons. You have no rules, no regulations, everyone racing to catch the last fish. You have people in government agencies that don't have the resources either to provide education or enforcement. And so what you have is chronic overfishing, which is denuding mangroves, seagrass beds, and coral reefs. Now, that's a conservation problem fast becoming a humanitarian crisis. Why? Because the ocean is warming up, the coral reefs are suffering, the mangroves are being depleted either for charcoal or for coastal development. So you're losing habitat, you're losing then the fish populations, which means you're losing the number one supply of animal protein for potentially 1 billion of the world's poorest and most climate vulnerable people. So we set out originally to respond to a call from some of our donors and some of our partners around the world to essentially run a pride campaign type approach to save coral reefs. What we realized is that we needed to engage all of the coastal society in becoming stewards for the whole ecosystem, for the seagrass beds, which were underappreciated, for the mangroves, which were underappreciated, and for the coral reefs, in a way that would boost incomes, create pride, and enable management. And so that wasn't as simple as just saying we need to stop putting birds in cages. This meant we need to decide with local fishers all over the world, where can we fish? How can we fish? Where should we never fish again? How can we come together and set up businesses that will enable us to sustainably fish? And so that program ended up with the title and the name Fish Forever, because the idea was not to stop fishing, but to enable sustainable fishing forever, which would enable sustainable coastal conservation forever. And that has been a 12-year journey. And it turns out it can be done. And we are doing it now with 2,000 communities in countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, Brazil, Mozambique, Honduras, Guatemala, places where 15 years ago it was thought we will never be able to restore these coastal waters. This is just too difficult.
So these programs across 2,000 territories, these are still founded upon the idea of creating a cultural and a psychological shift.
Absolutely.
And in each case, it's not so much pride in an individual species, but pride in self-determination and the outcome of vibrant fisheries forever. That is that it is very much at the heart of what Rare does, but just applied to fisheries and the inshore marine environment rather than parrots.
In this particular program, yes. In Fish Forever, it is leveraging behavioral insights, understanding that humans are incredibly social beings, and instilling a sense of pride. What at one point E.O. Wilson called a land ethic. You could call this a marine ethic. One that says, we the people depend on these waters. We the people therefore have in our self-interest a reason to protect these waters and to protect these habitats. And in the beginning, we had economists tell us, okay, so what are you going to do for these people when you tell them not to fish? What are you going to do for these people when all of a sudden you're going to have this J curve where people will have to stop fishing while the fisheries come back? And what's interesting is if you just look at humans as, Homo economicus, that would be true. If we were just species that walked around with a calculator determining what is in our best economic interest every day, guess what? We probably wouldn't drive really expensive cars that have to be in the shop, several times a year. We probably wouldn't buy really expensive clothing that doesn't last very long or is out of fashion very quickly. That's not very logical. It's not maximizing our economic utility. What does it do? It speaks to our pride. It speaks to what is socially acceptable or socially aspiring. Humans, whether they're rich or poor, are very similar all over the world. And so what it looks like in a fishery in the Philippines is a group of leaders get together and say, guys, Grandpa used to fill the boat in 4 hours. Dad used to fill the bucket in 4 hours. I went out for 4 hours today and I have trouble feeding my kids. We have to do something. And now it sounds like this Fish Forever thing is going to help us. I see these other communities down the way. I visited them. They're seeing 100%, 200% growth in their fish populations. We can do this too. And so then there's enough leadership and someone starts, and that creates social proof. And once there's social proof, you can leverage social pressure.
What do you think it is, Brett, that's missing in modern society? And I mean that very broadly. I mean, people all over the world seem to tolerate environmental degradation in a way that is inconceivable to me. I just had Pedro Prata from Rewilding Europe, and another previous podcast guest here at my place in Somerset. And he described to me the state of great swathes of his country, Portugal, which have just been converted to these monocultural plantations of eucalyptus and radiata pine. The soils are being trashed. The springs are running dry. There's dreadful fire risk. The wildlife and the birdsong have gone across really huge areas. The communities living in those landscapes seem not to care. How is it that all over the world, ecosystems are being trashed, landscapes are being rendered denuded, seascapes are being stripped of fish, and people don't, on the surface of it, really seem to care? It feels to me kind of like tolerating, I don't know, like shit in your bed or something, like how can you, all over the floor of your house, like how can, we want our houses to be clean and nice. And when guests come around, we feel pride in the place that we live. Why don't people feel the same way about their nature? And how do we resuscitate that feeling of love for nature? To quote E.O. Wilson, the biophilia in each of us, the innate love that we each feel for the non-human world. How do we resuscitate that and bring that to the fore so that people really do start kicking up a fuss about degradation and doing something collectively to restore nature in their area? This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com.
It's the most difficult question we face every day. I mean, that is the existential question that humankind is not actually asking itself. What's the phenomenon? There are people who would say we need to get kids out into nature, and I agree with them. There were people who say we need to better explain the problem, and I agree with them. There were people who say we need our politicians to understand what's at stake. We need to understand that our whole economy is based on nature. You can't build a house without destroying a forest. You can't heat a house without impacting the atmosphere. We can't commute to work without destabilizing the atmosphere. You can't make a meal without impacting the landscape. We are one species, of tens of millions or more that inhabit this planet. We have just been so technologically successful that we are outstripping its ability to support us. So what's needed? An ethic, a movement, economic incentives, political will, and leadership. We need to change the way we inhabit the planet. And it can be done. This is what we've been doing, but we have probably changed the behavior of, I would say at most, 20 million citizens of planet Earth over the last 25 years. We're very proud of that. We've been very successful in many ways, but you could also say that's a drop in the bucket. So what does scaling planetary stewardship look like? What does scaling pride in nature look like? And so that gets to sort of the next phase of our work. That's where we're headed. And I wouldn't say we feel singularly we have the solution, but we are very excited about some of the things we are working on right now.
So King Charles, formerly the Prince of Wales, wrote a book that had a big impact on me, which is called Harmony, I guess 15 or 18 years ago. Tony Juniper helped him with it, current chairman of Natural England. And in it, what he describes is a kind of break from nature at the time of the Enlightenment. He says that previously, pretty much all societies on Earth found God in nature. There was no distinction between the ineffable and the physical. God is eternal, God is in all things, and therefore when we walk in nature, we are walking we're surrounded by God. And what he argues in that book, Harmony, is that at the time of the Enlightenment, we put God in the realm of kind of the invisible up somewhere in the sky, a guy with a white beard and up there with the ghosts and the spirits, and everything that we can see and touch and feel. In other words, the physical world is a larder that we can exploit and use as we like. The kind of separation of God and nature. And he points to that moment as being the cause of all our problems. He today, King Charles, is involved in a bunch of interfaith initiatives, interfaith initiatives on deforestation and so on. And at their heart, what these initiatives are trying to do is they're trying to put God back into nature. In the Laudatum Si, which was the Pope's encyclical that talks about our duty of stewardship and so on, there's similar kind of initiatives in the Muslim world. And of course, those who maintain shamanistic kind of pre-monotheistic religious traditions, the world's indigenous or First Nations people, for them, God has always been and remains within nature. And it seems to me no accident that 80% of the world's intact ecosystems are in the stewardship of those people, those people who still find the spiritual within nature. So the essence of this book, Harmony, that had such an effect on me is that in order to save nature, we need to re-enchant it in some way. Now, what do you say to that? I don't know if you're a religious guy or how do you feel about that line of inquisition?
I'm not terribly religious, but I'm very spiritual, and my spirituality has in many ways always been connected to nature. I spent a lot of time as a child in the woods, like probably many conservationists. So I would say there is a deep link and there is a source of inspiration that we find in nature that we should be working to harness, whether it's through spiritual, religious, or other means. I wouldn't argue. I think that's part of the portfolio. I don't think that's going to solve the problem, but it is certainly part of the solution. And from our own practical experience, I don't think we've run a single one of our 500 campaigns in 60 countries without invoking the leadership of religious figures within each of these communities. So if you go out and you begin to study social psychology, evolutionary biology, decision science, behavioral economics, you begin to find inspiration in the idea that, to make it really simple, think about a savanna. When does the gazelle take off? A single gazelle might take off because they see the lion. But the majority of the gazelles are only going to run when they see everybody else run. And so why not take advantage of that? So as conservationists, one of the things that we're most passionate about today is the idea that we can not only help other conservationists leverage this 25-year revolution in behavioral science led by Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and now followed through with Richard Thaler, and now Elke Weber and Eric Johnson, and folks all over the planet who have become really, really insightful about what drives human behavior. The question is, how do we turn that into a toolkit? How do we translate those insights and make them available? What if we were able to normalize some of the behaviors that someone who loves the earth would adopt? And so here's where we can move from E.O. Wilson's concept of biophilia, King Charles's concept of harmony. What would that look like in practice in our daily lives? Well, today, if you're a person of means in the United States, you drive an electric vehicle and you charge it with solar panels at home. And that way you reduce dramatically your emissions, which reduces the impact and the threat to coral reefs and to seagrass beds and mangroves, to coastal communities with sea level rise, to acidification of the ocean. And you do that with two simple behaviors: adopting an electric vehicle and charging it with your own solar panels. And there's an upfront cost and an upfront impact, but over the next 20 years, you have reduced by probably 50% your carbon footprint. Now, national level leaders in many countries have created incentives to do this, but those laws that have been passed, in my mind, are the halftime show. It is incumbent upon all of us to help implement those laws by adopting these practices. Now, take one final example, and that would be plant-rich diets. If you truly love nature, you're not going to cut down the entire forest and plant 500 heads of cattle so that you can eat beef on a daily basis. So you're going to reduce your consumption of beef. You don't have to stop eating it, but we need to dramatically reduce human consumption of beef because it's not sustainable. Therefore, what can we do as behavior change agents? Well, what if when you're watching Queen Charlotte, it just becomes normal that her court is vegetarian? That's one of the ways that we normalize really good human behavior.
Yeah, and I suppose the most successful campaign along those lines is said to have been the designated driver campaign of the 1980s, where it became normalized in the plot of TV series and films and so on that there would be a designated non-drinking driver at all social functions. They even hung the plot on that on occasions. And I know that there are similar efforts to normalize the science of climate change and general environmental responsibility in the plot writing now of creative content. What I find so amazing about Rare is that it injects this missing ingredient, this sociological or psychological or cultural or even spiritual understanding into environmental campaigns. And they always say that the most successful environmental campaigns are made up like an orchestra of a number of different initiatives and organizations doing slightly different things that all come together to make the music and create the impact. And so Rare is, I think, an extraordinarily important part of that that maybe the most important part of that orchestra. So it's very exciting to see how big the organization has grown and to see how many projects you have since we first met, which must be coming up a decade now. And I just want to thank you so much, Brett, for taking the time to participate in this podcast and have this conversation with me. It means a great deal to me.
Well, thank you, Ben. It's brilliant what you're doing. I love your show, and I love the way you approach it. So thanks so much.
I so enjoyed catching up with my friend Brett Jenks of Rare. It really is an extraordinary organization that he's built, and they've had tremendous success. The key being harnessing human behavior, culture, and spirituality to protect nature, and it really works. If you enjoyed the episode as much as I enjoyed making it, I'll be so grateful if you go onto whatever platform you use to get your podcasts and give us a like, maybe a review, spread the word among your friends. We're growing really nicely, and this helps a lot. Next time, I'm going to be talking to a really good friend of mine, someone who's inspired me more than almost anyone else in my life, Derek Gow, the gorilla rewilder, so called. Derek, a former farmer from Scotland, now in Devon, a rewilding champion who has pioneered the restoration of species from water voles to beavers to wildcats, none of which would be recovering in Britain in the way that they are if it wasn't for Derek. He's a true hero. I hope you'll join us.
You already know that this isn't about one species. It's about systems, interdependence, collapse. And yet, wild salmon, one of the clearest indicators we have, are vanishing fast. Their decline signals something deeper, something more dangerous. I'm Jim Murray. I host The Last Salmon. It's not a side story. It's the biodiversity story that everyone like you should be listening to. Season 2's out now.
One of the best ways to support rewilding is to go and visit rewilding projects on the ground. My friends at the European Nature Trust have asked me to tell you about a series of coexistence adventures that they've put together. They're designed to give you the best chance of seeing Europe's most iconic species, bears, wolves, lynx, and so on. All of these are on the rise in Europe because of rewilding projects. These trips are hosted by expert guides and conservationists, and most importantly, the European Nature Trust is giving half of the revenues directly to the foundations working on the ground to restore wildlife. I'd love you to check out these coexistence adventures at the European Nature Trust website.